Okay, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about copyright infringement, but to understand copyright infringement, first and foremost we need to understand what copyright is. So as such, we'll be talking about that to begin. Now, copyright is an unregistered right, and it essentially protects original creative work. So original creative work are things that people make typically without necessarily realizing it, which can include things like writing, images, whether kind of drawn or photography, videos, music, sounds, recordings, all these kinds of different things. And there's a very specific list of these, which again, if you get into the nuts and bolts of it, you can find. But essentially, people create these all the time, and essentially at the point when they're created, if they're original, they attract this right, which is essentially called copyright, which protects it. That means that if somebody else wants to use that, you have a certain set of rights as the creator over that work, both in terms of your moral rights, which is to do with attribution and kind of things of that nature in terms of having your name attached to the work, but also economic rights, which is to say if people use it and they're gaining kind of revenue from it, that you are entitled to some form of reimbursement for that use. Generally speaking, in the UK, copyright lasts 70 years after the death of the author or the creator of the copyright work. So you hear about this all the time with things like Sherlock Holmes or Winnie the Pooh very recently, where the original author had died and then 70 years afterwards, that then becomes a public domain piece of work which then everybody can make use of. Fundamentally, the reason copyright exists is to reward the creators of original work with enough of a kind of economic and moral right over that work. But later on, there's a kind of point where it enters the public domain so that other people can create, commercial opportunity surrounding it. But for the most part, from the first instance, copyright helps creators gain money and have ownership over their creative outputs. So now we know what copyright is. What is copyright infringement? In the world of intellectual property, what infringement generally means is the idea of somebody using someone's IP without the express written or legal permission of the owner of that intellectual property. In essence, this takes the form of people perhaps using a brand, for example, or copying things off a website, and essentially taking somebody else's knowledge assets or intangible assets and making use of it themselves for their own economic benefit. This can have bad consequences for the original owner of the IP insofar as it will usually it diverts profits or revenue away from the original creators in a sense by pretending to be the original creator. And then it can also result in damage of reputation. And how this happens is that those who kind of infringe on IP will typically provide a sub-quality product. However, the person who will be kind of on the receiving end of this product will think it's genuine and think that the producer of that particular IP is, producing a substandard product when that's not actually the case. So it's very important for creators to essentially nip infringement in the bud. And as we were saying before, copyright infringement in and of itself is a very specific type of IP infringement, and this is relating to the infringement of these creative assets that we discussed in the previous section. What's particularly interesting about copyright infringement is that you see something happen quite a bit, which is known as secondary infringement. Secondary infringement refers to the infringement by somebody, but not necessarily the person who originally kind of stole or copied the work. So in the case of perhaps, I don't know, say there's a book, let's say Game of Thrones, for example, and somebody has created illegal copies of this book. So essentially they've got the original book, they've copied it word for word and created books that they're selling themselves, which aren't licensed by the original creator, George R.R. Martin. Now, if you worked on a market stall or an online seller and you were selling these books in a way that you knew, or indeed perhaps even didn't know that these were themselves infringing the original copyright, you could be actually liable for a claim which is secondary infringement, which means that you are selling or making profit from originally essentially pirated or counterfeit works. So it's very important for creators and people who are selling copyright works to be aware that they have the correct licenses and permissions to do so from the original copyright holders. If you suspect something's happening, you may see, for example, posts online or a website that's very similar to your own, that's using similar assets, whether that's the writing, the imagery, the layout even, or indeed, the kind of copy that's on the page. The first thing that our legal team speak to people who are in this situation about is to kind of gather as much evidence as possible that this is happening, because as soon as the other side is alerted to your awareness that you may be aware that they're infringing your copyright, is they may begin to take everything down. And in the case of building a copyright case, it's very important to have a lot of evidence in relation to the infringement, a lot of evidence in terms of where it's occurring, what time it was occurring from, and this helps the legal team such as ours essentially build the case and build an understanding of what the damage is in terms of this infringement. If someone claims that you have infringed their copyright, also very important to make sure that you get in touch with the legal team straight away to assess the kind of severity and the veracity of the claim. Usually things to look out for here, which our legal team highlight to people, is, for example, the legal letter itself. Does it look like a serious outfit? Do they have a kind of very strong claim in there? Is it very well kind of detailed in the letter? Now again, you might have an idea if that's the case or not, but a legal team will certainly be able to help you with that, as they come across these kinds of letters and claims all the time, and they'll know what is legitimate and what might be perhaps a little bit ambitious, shall we say, in terms of a claim. Equally, quite important to make sure that you kind of keep records of the alleged infringing material. Make sure that you kind of take down anything that might be potentially infringing. And a reason for this is it just limits the amount of damage in terms of if it is genuinely infringing, whether you meant to or not. Essentially if you've been caught in an infringement, then you'll want to make sure that the amount of kind of economic damage to the other side is limited, to make sure that you're not paying as much as you could when it comes down to the kind of damages assessment. So again, always very important to get in touch with a legal team, always important to kind of be aware of the severity of the claim, and ultimately this all comes from an awareness of copyright. And you can kind of avoid these claims in the first instance by making sure that you're aware of what you can use and what you can't use without kind of obtaining a copyright license from somebody. So the aim of copyright is to not necessarily put people in jail unless they're committing a criminal act such as counterfeiting or otherwise, but rather put the copyright owner back in the position that they would have been had the infringement not occurred. This typically results in the award of damages, for example. So say like if you lost 50 grand because you did not make use of your website because somebody else had siphoned off that traffic, and it was kind of calculated to be 50 grand, that's what you'd be looking to get back on damages. And indeed, obviously, your legal costs. So in terms of preventing copyright infringement, whether that's in terms of accidentally yourself committing copyright infringement, or indeed making sure that other people don't gain access to your work, there's two kind of essential characteristics of things that you should be aware of as a creator. Number one is educating yourself about copyright, so you know where the lines are, having a kind of sense of, at this point, do not cross in terms of how you might use somebody else's work, and having an awareness of how things such as, open source licensing works, Creative Commons, where to find kind of free to use assets, which are kind of, there's plenty of them out there which people can use freely without a kind of sense of a copyright claim coming in. And then secondly, it would be to, as a creator, make sure that people are aware of your copyright ownership. Again, previously mentioned, it's about having the kind of copyright logo on your work and making sure that people are aware that you consider this to be copyright material and that you'll enforce it as such. And again, there's plenty of resources out there in terms of things you can read to understand copyright a bit better. It's very well harmonized around the world typically, so it is one of those rights where it isn't typically too different depending on where you are. But again, if you are somebody who kind of relies on creating as your bread and butter of your income, it would be very beneficial for you to speak to legal professionals to understand where your liability is in terms of how you're using copyright material and how you kind of are protecting the copyright material that you make yourself.